Hello everyone, I'm Crime Whisper, and I know many of you love listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. And if you enjoy the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into tonight's chilling case. It was a quiet autumn night in Tokyo. The calm atmosphere of an apartment complex was suddenly shattered by desperate cries for help echoing through the hallway. Behind one locked door, a young woman frantically called the police. Just outside that same door, another young woman, a foreign student, lay motionless, bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds. In mere moments, the building's peaceful silence had turned into a horrifying crime scene, one that would ignite intense debates across both Japan and China about humanity, morality, and justice. So what really happened behind that locked door? In the early morning hours of November 3rd, 2016, police in Tokyo's Nakano district received 2 consecutive emergency calls from the same number. On the other end of the line was a trembling, panicked young woman. The dispatcher could clearly hear her shouting to someone in the background, "Lock the door. Don't cause trouble anymore." Then, a blood-curdling scream. Moments later, the woman returned to the phone, crying, "My friend has collapsed. Please, hurry." Recognizing the urgency, both police and paramedics rushed to the scene. When they arrived at the second-floor apartment, what they found was beyond horrifying. A young woman lay on the floor, unconscious, blood still flowing from stab wounds to her neck. The autopsy report later revealed she had been stabbed more than 10 times. One wound, about 4 inches deep, had completely severed her left carotid artery, the fatal blow. The murder weapon, a small fruit knife, was found beside her body. The hallway was a mess, scattered items, overturned shoes, and bloody footprints, evidence of a violent struggle. The victim had collapsed right in front of the apartment door, as if she'd been desperately trying to escape, but was blocked by her attacker. Despite being rushed to the hospital, she never made it. When officers knocked on the apartment door, the same door near where the attack occurred, they discovered a woman still inside. She was terrified, hysterical, and kept shouting for them not to come in. Convinced someone dangerous was still out there, it took several minutes of calm persuasion before she finally opened the door. Inside, police found Lu Zun, a young woman in shock. Once she regained some composure, she identified the victim as Jiang Gi, her close friend and roommate. Both were Chinese international students living together in Tokyo. Through tears, Lu Zun told investigators that the attacker was her ex-boyfriend, Chen Shifeng. She claimed he had secretly followed them home that night, and when Jiang tried to protect her, he attacked. This confession immediately gave police a clear suspect. During their investigation, officers found a whiskey bottle left in the stairwell between the second and third floors. Fingerprint tests confirmed it belonged to Chen, Shifeng. It suggested something chilling, that he had been waiting there in the dark, drinking, possibly watching, and planning his attack. The evidence painted a clear picture. This was not a random killing. It was a deliberate, emotionally driven murder, fueled by jealousy, rage, and betrayal. When Jiang Jie's mother, Jiang Quelian, received the news of her daughter's death, her world shattered. She refused to believe it at first. Her only child, gone, in a foreign country, brutally murdered while trying to protect someone she called a friend. But her grief soon turned into determination. She vowed to uncover the truth and to fight for justice for her daughter. Jiang Jie was just 24 years old, a kind-hearted, energetic young woman from China. Those who knew her described her as optimistic and full of life. She loved her family deeply and always put others before herself. In April 2016, she moved to Tokyo to pursue a master's degree in linguistics. Her dream was to build a better future for herself and to make her mother proud. No, one could have imagined that just months later, her life would end in such tragedy, and that her final act would be one of selfless bravery. She died protecting her friend, and yet the story didn't end there. In fact, it was only the beginning of a long and painful battle, one that would divide public opinion, test friendships, and spark a nationwide debate on morality, loyalty, and justice, because what happened after the murder was almost as shocking as the crime itself. Friends, tonight's story takes a heartbreaking turn. Zhang Yi was known for her independence, kindness, and her willingness to help anyone in need. But tragically, it was that very kindness, the one quality that defined her, that led her to her fatal end. About 2 months before the murder, Zhang agreed to let her friend Liu Xin, who came from the same hometown, temporarily stay with her in her Tokyo apartment. Liu was trying to escape the obsessive control and harassment of her ex-boyfriend, Chen Shifeng, a man known for his possessive, unstable behavior. Zhang didn't think twice. Out of compassion, she opened her home and her heart to help her friend find safety. Over the next several weeks, Zhang became more than a friend. She became a source of comfort and protection. Whenever Liu felt anxious or frightened, Zhang would listen, console, and encourage her. And every time Chen Shifeng showed up to cause trouble, it was Jiang who stepped in, mediating and trying to calm the situation. Those close to Jiang said she had always been selfless. Her parents had divorced when she was very young, and she was raised by her mother, Zhang Quelian, a hard-working single parent. Studying abroad wasn't just a dream for Jiang. It was a way to give back to her mother and change both their lives for the better. To make that dream possible, Zhang studied hard during the day and worked part-time jobs at night. She paid her own tuition, covered her living expenses, and even sent money back home. She was determined to build a better future, until one fateful night in November 2016 changed everything. That evening, while she was studying on campus, Zhang received a distressed message from Liu Xin. Her friend was terrified, convinced that Chen Shifeng was following her again. Without hesitation, Zhang rushed out to meet her, determined to bring her safely home. She had no idea that this single act of loyalty, this one decision to protect her friend, would lead her directly into danger. As soon as the murder was reported, Tokyo police launched an intensive investigation, led by the Nakano District Police Department. Based on Liu Xin's initial statement, detectives quickly identified the prime suspect, Chen Shi, a 25-year-old Chinese national studying in Japan, and Liu's ex-boyfriend. But Chen had already fled the scene. A citywide manhunt began immediately. 4 days later, on November 7, 2016, authorities located and arrested Chen. However, they didn't initially charge him with murder. The evidence wasn't yet complete. Instead, they detained him on a lesser charge, making death threats, based on the threatening messages he had previously sent to Liu. This allowed police to legally hold him in custody while they built their case for a premeditated murder. Just when investigators were making progress, an unexpected twist shocked the public. On November 8, as Japanese media reported Chen's arrest, Liu Xin made statements that startled everyone. She claimed she hadn't seen the attacker that night and had no useful information to offer. Her detached attitude and her refusal to meet with Zhang, the grieving mother, sparked outrage across China. Online forums erupted with criticism, accusing Liu of coldness, dishonesty, and moral cowardice. How could she avoid the woman whose daughter had died trying to save her? As public anger grew, new details emerged during the police investigation. In private sessions, Liu Xin finally revealed some crucial information. She admitted that on November 2nd, the day before the murder, Chen Shifeng had shown up at their apartment to cause trouble. Zhang wanted to call the police, but Liu stopped her. Why? Because she was afraid that if their landlord discovered they were living together, two people, sharing a small space, they'd be evicted for violating the rental agreement. Liu didn't want to draw attention or cause problems. That small decision, not to involve the authorities, would later haunt her forever. Liu also confessed that on the night of the crime, terrified that Chen was still watching her, she had messaged Zhang to come home with her. Zhang agreed without hesitation. However, one major inconsistency in Liu's story caught investigators' attention. She claimed she hadn't heard the doorbell ring, and that she never locked the apartment door before Zhang was attacked outside. But this statement directly contradicted the audio evidence from the emergency call. In the recorded call, Liu's voice is clearly heard shouting from inside the apartment. "The door is already locked. Stop it, Chen." Moments later, the audio captures Jiang's agonizing screams from the hallway. That recording proved beyond doubt that Liu had locked the door, leaving Jiang outside, face to face with her attacker. Why did she deny it? Police and psychologists offered two possibilities. Either she was so traumatized that her memory of that chaotic moment was blurred by panic, or she was deliberately hiding the truth, trying to avoid the unbearable guilt of knowing her actions had sealed her friend's fate. Whatever the reason, the contradiction deepened public anger and set the stage for one of the most emotionally charged murder trials in Japan's recent history, a case that questioned not only justice, but also the meaning of friendship, loyalty, and conscience. The investigation team worked tirelessly, combing through every piece of evidence and every second of security footage from around the apartment complex. Their goal was to reconstruct the suspect's movements and uncover the full truth behind the horrific murder. Surveillance videos eventually revealed a chilling timeline of events. On the evening of November 2nd, 2016, Chen Shifeng was seen stopping at a nearby convenience store, purchasing a small bottle of whiskey. Shortly afterward, he quietly slipped into the building where Zhang Ji and Lu Xin lived and hid himself in the stairwell, waiting in the shadows. Police later confirmed this through meticulous forensic work. Fingerprints and DNA found on the whiskey bottle and the murder weapon, a fruit knife, both matched Chen. Digital forensics painted an even darker picture. Analysis of Chen's phone records showed that he had been tracking Lu Xin's every move for weeks before the murder. His call logs and text messages revealed a long pattern of harassment and threats, a disturbing digital trail that pointed to his obsessive jealousy. The most haunting piece of evidence was a text message he sent on the very night of November 2nd, just hours before the attack. In it, Chen vowed that he would use any means necessary to achieve his goal. That threat lined up perfectly with his later actions, buying alcohol, preparing a weapon, and waiting in ambush. By November 22nd, 2016, Tokyo police had gathered overwhelming evidence. They officially issued an arrest warrant for premeditated murder. But even in custody, Chen Shifeng refused to take responsibility. During interrogations, he repeatedly changed his story, denied the charges, and tried to deflect blame onto others, even suggesting that those around him were partly responsible for what happened, because the case involved multiple Chinese citizens on foreign soil. Japanese authorities requested assistance from Chinese police to verify each person's background. The results of that joint investigation painted a clearer picture of the man behind the crime. Chen Shi, born in 1991, was a self-funded Chinese international student pursuing graduate studies in Tokyo. He came from a middle-class family and had no prior criminal record. Outwardly, he appeared intelligent, ambitious, and polite, but beneath that surface lay deep psychological instability. He had met Lu Xin during their time in Japan, and the two began dating. But as their relationship progressed, Chen's behavior turned possessive and volatile. He constantly checked on her, demanded control over her actions, and grew jealous over the smallest things. What started as minor disagreements quickly escalated into emotional abuse. Eventually, in the fall of 2016, Lu Xin decided to end the relationship for her own safety. That's when Jun's true nature fully emerged. He could not accept rejection. He began stalking Liu, bombarding her with threatening messages and phone calls. In his most extreme moments, he even threatened to release her private photos to her family if she didn't return to him. He was intelligent, but emotionally unstable. There was no evidence of mental illness or prior criminal behavior, yet his obsession and possessiveness had completely consumed him. Investigators later discovered that Zhang Yi had no personal conflict with Chen. They barely interacted. Their only connection was through Lu Xin, but in Chen's warped mind, Zhang became the enemy. He believed she was the one encouraging Liu to leave him. He convinced himself that Zhang had stolen his girlfriend's loyalty and poisoned their relationship. That irrational hatred festered until it exploded into violence. Several mutual acquaintances told police that Chen had openly blamed Zhang, accusing her of meddling in his relationship. But in reality, Zhang had simply done what any decent friend would do: protect someone in danger. For Chen, though, that act of kindness became unforgivable. His motive was driven by pure emotional vengeance, a twisted need to punish not only the woman who rejected him, but also the friend who stood in his way. While the investigation unfolded, one painful detail stood out. Chen's family never once reached out to express sympathy or remorse to Zhang Jie's mother. Not a single apology, not a word of condolence. For Zhang, that silence was a wound that deepened her grief. Her daughter had died thousands of miles from home, and yet, even the simplest act of acknowledgement was denied to her. By December 2016, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police had completed their case file and submitted it to the Tokyo Prosecutor's Office. After months of review, on October 14, 2017, prosecutors formally indicted Chen Shifeng on 2 major charges: threatening to kill, intentional premeditated murder. The evidence was overwhelming, but even as the trial approached, public debate raged on, not about Chen's guilt, which was clear, but about Lu Xin's role in the tragedy. Her actions, her denials, and her silence had created one of the most heated moral discussions in modern Chinese and Japanese society. The sole survivor of the case could never have imagined the storm that was about to unfold. To fully understand what happened on that tragic night, we need to turn back time to the early days of November 2016. On November 2nd, 2016, Shifeng arrived at Zhang Ji's apartment, where Lu Zhen was temporarily staying. He rang the doorbell persistently, shouting and demanding to see Lu Zhen to talk about their breakup. Terrified, Lu Zhen refused to open the door. In a panic, she sent a desperate message to her close friend, Zhang Ji, who was away on business at the time. When Zhang Ji received the message, she immediately told Lu Zhen to lock the door, and initially considered calling the police. But Lu Zhen stopped her, afraid their cohabitation would be exposed, something that would violate the rental agreement. She also didn't want the situation to escalate into public trouble, respecting her friend's wishes. Zhang Ji reluctantly agreed not to involve the authorities, and instead rushed home from school. By around 4 p.m., she arrived at the apartment and calmly began mediating the situation. Through patience and empathy, she managed to persuade Shifeng to leave, but as he walked away, his eyes burned with a cold, restrained, furious, silent promise of vengeance. That evening, Zhang Ji had to attend night classes. Before leaving, she reminded Lu Zhen to be careful and keep the doors locked. Neither of them realized that Shifeng hadn't truly gone. In the shadows nearby, he was watching, waiting, his mind already forming a plan. Later that evening, Lu Zhen left for her part-time restaurant job. As she worked, her phone buzzed relentlessly. It was Shifeng, again, this time sending a barrage of threats and emotional blackmail. His messages grew darker, filled with rage. Finally, he crossed the line. He threatened to release her private photos to her family if she didn't meet him face to face. Panicked and cornered, Lu Zhen came up with a desperate idea. She asked a male co-worker to pretend to be her boyfriend and confront Shafing, hoping it would make him stop. The confrontation was brief, but explosive. In front of the man, Lu Zhen firmly declared that she had moved on, and there was no chance of reconciliation. Humiliated and enraged, Shafing smashed his phone on the ground, then glared at her one last time. His final words were chilling. He would use any means necessary to get what he wanted. By 7 p.m., he returned to his room, consumed by fury. There, he began preparing for revenge. He concealed a 3.7-inch fruit knife inside his clothes, packed a spare set of clean clothes in case of blood, and bought a bottle of whiskey from a nearby store to steel his nerves. That night, around 11 p.m., Lu Zhen finished her shift and messaged Zhang Ji. She said she was at the train station, but confessed she was scared. She felt like she was being watched. Alarmed, Zhang Ji immediately boarded a train to bring her home safely. Throughout the ride, she kept texting Lu Zhen, reassuring her that she'd be there soon, just after midnight. The two friends met at the station and began walking back together. Their steps were quick, their voices low. They were both uneasy, though neither could have imagined what awaited them. Unbeknownst to them, Shifing was already there. He had broken into the building hours earlier and was now hiding in the stairwell between the second and third floors. 4 hours, he had sat in the darkness, sipping whiskey, muttering to himself, feeding his rage. When the two women entered the dim corridor, Lu Zhen walked ahead, with Zhang Ji just behind her. Zhang planned to see her friend safely to the door, then return to school. As they neared the apartment, Lu Zhen felt a wave of unease, like someone was watching them. Then out of the darkness Shifing lunged. Knife flashing in the faint light, he blocked their path, his face twisted with hatred. Zhang Ji screamed. Instinctively, she tried to protect her friend, stepping forward to shield her. Lu Zhen, driven purely by survival instinct, darted inside the apartment and slammed the door shut. She locked it instantly, unaware that her action had just sealed Zhang Ji's fate. Trapped in the narrow hallway, Zhang Ji turned to face the attacker. The only light came from the weak flicker of a hallway bulb. Shafing let out a guttural scream and charged. In the chaos, Zhang Ji fought back desperately, her terrified cries echoing through the corridor until they were suddenly silenced by the darkness. Withdrew his appeal, effectively confirming the 25-year prison sentence handed down by the Tokyo District Court. By then, the tragedy that had taken Zhang Ji's life was not only a story of senseless violence, it had become a symbol of heartbreak, justice, and the deep scars left on those who survived. The chaotic struggle that night had been brief, but horrifying. In a frenzy, Shifing's knife strikes landed again and again, each one more brutal than the last. Blood splattered across the narrow hallway walls as Zhang Ji's strength slowly faded. Her trembling hands left smudges of red on the apartment door, evidence of her final, desperate attempt to reach safety. She had pounded on the door, again and again, crying for help, but no one answered. Inside, Lu Zhen crouched in terror, frozen by the sounds outside each muffled scream, each thud of the knife cutting through flesh. Her mind went blank. Only after the hallway fell into a dreadful silence did she shakily pick up her phone and dial the police. Even though she knew her friend was right outside, perhaps still breathing, fear had paralyzed her. She couldn't bring herself to open the door. Meanwhile, Shifing fled, stumbling down the stairs after hearing her voice on the phone. When the first police sirens wailed through the night, he had already vanished into the cold darkness of the city. Within 10 minutes, officers and paramedics arrived at the scene. They found Zhang Ji collapsed at the doorway, her body soaked in blood. The paramedics tried desperately to resuscitate her as they rushed to the hospital, but the wounds were too severe. She had lost too much blood. She died on the way, at just 24 years old. The murder case quickly gained attention across Japan and beyond, especially among the Chinese community. Public outrage and heartbreak surged as news spread about the bright young woman who had been murdered while protecting her friend. When the Tokyo District Court announced the trial, so many people applied to attend that the court had to use a lottery system to select attendees. Only 30 people were allowed inside the courtroom each day. The trial lasted 7 days, from October 11th to 18th, 2017. Throughout the proceedings, Schiffing remained eerily calm. His expression was detached, his tone steady, chillingly so. He admitted to sending threatening messages to Lu Zhen, but denied premeditated murder. In his version, the killing was a tragic accident, the result of a scuffle gone wrong, but the prosecution dismantled his claims, piece by piece. They presented a meticulous timeline, his earlier threats, the knife he had hidden in his clothing, the spare clothes he packed for after the crime, the whiskey he drank as he waited, and the 10 deep stab wounds, each aimed at vital areas. Every detail revealed clear intent and premeditation. The prosecutors argued that this was not a crime of passion, but a cold, calculated act driven by revenge. They demanded the maximum fixed-term sentence allowed under Japanese law for a single victim murder, 25 years in prison. The trial also saw Lu Zhen's testimony, though not in person, due to intense public scrutiny and fear for her safety. She testified remotely via video link from a private room. Her account, however, raised controversy. She claimed she hadn't locked the door and that she had only gone inside briefly to change clothes because she was menstruating. She said she heard screams and then found the door blocked when she tried to open it. But the jury questioned inconsistencies. They asked, "If you didn't know what was happening, why did you call the police saying you were under attack?" Lu Zhen hesitated, unable to give a clear answer. The silence in the courtroom that followed was suffocating. Among those attending was Zhang Ji's mother, Zhang Kilian, representing her late daughter. She carried with her a petition signed by 4.5 million people from Chinese communities around the world demanding that the court sentence Schiffing to death. Standing before the judges, her voice trembled through tears as she said, "He has never apologized. Not once. Not to me. Not to my daughter. He feels no remorse." Her words pierced the courtroom. Even seasoned reporters were seen wiping away tears. Yet, as the defense lawyers reminded the public, Japan's justice system was bound by law, not emotion. The verdict would have to reflect the legal framework, not public pressure. After 6 days of public hearings and 1 day of closed deliberations, on the afternoon of October 20th, 2017, the court reached its decision. The presiding judge announced, "The court finds the defendant guilty of intentional murder and criminal threats. He is sentenced to 25 years imprisonment." As the verdict was read, Schiffing suddenly collapsed at the defendant's bench. His body convulsed. Sweat poured down his face. Some thought it was shock, others believed it was the moment he finally understood that his life was over. When he regained consciousness, moments later, the reality of his 25-year sentence was read to him once again. He lowered his head, silent. In the gallery, Zhang Ji's mother clutched her daughter's framed photo and sobbed uncontrollably. To her, justice had not been fully served. "He took my daughter's life," she cried. "He should pay with his own." 2 months later, on December 22nd, 2017, Schiffing filed an appeal, but only a week later, on December 29th, he withdrew it, sealing his fate. The verdict stood 20-5 years in prison, 20-5 years for a life that could never be replaced. And yet, for those who loved Zhang Ji, the sentence brought little peace. The wounds she left behind would take far longer than 25 years to heal, if they ever healed at all. The original store key to open the drawers, suggesting that the killer was someone familiar with the victims, someone who knew the store's layout, Shang Ming's habits, and where the cash was kept. This immediately shifted the direction of the investigation from a random robbery to a targeted crime committed by someone close. the local police began by interviewing family members, neighbors, and nearby shop owners. Everyone described Shang Ming as kind, soft-spoken, and hardworking. He had no known enemies and was well liked in the community. Yet, as the investigation deepened, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. One key detail stood out: the placement of the 5 mineral water bottles on Shang Ming's body. To many villagers, this seemed like a strange ritual or symbolic gesture. However, forensic experts believed it might have been a deliberate act by the killer to mislead investigators, to make the crime appear to be the work of a mentally unstable person or someone performing a spiritual ritual. The autopsy revealed that Xiang Ming had been struck in the head with a blunt object, likely while asleep, causing immediate loss of consciousness and death within minutes. There were no defensive wounds, confirming he hadn't even had the chance to fight back. But what object had been used? Investigators found a blood-stained iron wrench hidden under a storage shelf in the store. It was wrapped in a towel belonging to the household, and partial fingerprints were discovered on the handle. The prints were sent for urgent analysis. Meanwhile, police carefully examined the store's surveillance camera, a small system Shang Yun had installed 6 months earlier. Although the footage didn't directly capture the attack, it did record movement near the store. Around 2:47 a.m., a shadowy figure could be seen entering with a key, turning off the lights, and disappearing into the back room. About 30 minutes later, the same person exited quickly, locking the door behind him. The figure's build was slim, and his gait looked familiar to investigators who had spent days in the area interviewing locals. When compared with earlier footage from the previous week, police noticed the movement pattern was strikingly similar to Shang Yun, the victim's younger brother. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigative team. Could the grieving brother who had discovered the body be the actual killer? To confirm their suspicions, police quietly began a background inquiry into Xiang Yun. Records revealed that the brothers had shared the store business equally for several years. However, recently, financial disputes had erupted between them. Shang Ming had reportedly refused to sell the store's land rights, despite his younger brother's insistence, believing it was too risky. A neighbor also revealed that 2 nights before the murder, the brothers had been heard arguing loudly about money. Another witness, a supplier, claimed that Shang Yun had been under pressure from loan sharks after taking out high-interest loans to expand his own small side business. The motive was beginning to form: debt and greed. 3 days after the murder, forensic results confirmed that Xiang Yun's fingerprints matched those found on the wrench. Police immediately summoned him for questioning. At first, he appeared calm and cooperative, even expressing sorrow over his brother's death. But when confronted with the fingerprint evidence and the surveillance footage, his demeanor changed drastically. His hands trembled, and sweat rolled down his forehead. After several hours of interrogation, he finally broke down and confessed. According to his confession, on the night of May 21st, Shang Yun had gone to his brother's store after midnight. He had been drinking heavily and was desperate for cash to repay a debt due the next morning. When Shang Ming refused to hand over the store's savings, an argument broke out. In a fit of drunken rage, Shang Yun grabbed the wrench from a nearby shelf and struck his brother on the head. Panicking when he realized Shang Ming was dead, he staged the scene to look like a robbery by an outsider. He took some money from the drawer, scattered a few items, and placed the 5 mineral water bottles on the body, hoping to mislead investigators into thinking it was a ritual killing. Afterwards, he wiped the surfaces hastily, locked the door from outside using his spare key, and returned home to pretend to discover the murder hours later. The confession shocked the entire village. Neighbors who had long admired the close bond between the Shang brothers were left speechless. Many couldn't believe that greed and desperation had driven a man to kill his own flesh and blood. The trial began in early 2014 at the Sichuan Intermediate People's Court. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the fingerprints, the surveillance footage, the wrench, and Shang Yun's own confession. His defense attempted to argue for leniency, claiming intoxication and temporary loss of control, but the court was unmoved. The judge emphasized that despite his drunken state, Shang Yun's subsequent actions, cleaning the scene, locking the door, and staging evidence demonstrated clear awareness and intent to conceal the crime. On June 28, 2014, the court sentenced Shang Yun to death with a 2-year reprieve, meaning his sentence could be commuted to life imprisonment if he showed good behavior. In his final statement, Shang Yun wept and said, "I've killed the only person who ever truly loved me. I wish I could trade my life for his." But for the Shang family, the damage was irreversible. The small convenience store was permanently closed, and villagers erected a small memorial near the site in memory of Xiang Ming, the quiet man whose kindness was repaid with betrayal. The crime scene, after being visited by numerous people, had become chaotic and disorganized, making it far more difficult for investigators to reconstruct the true sequence of events. Valuable traces that could have provided key leads were likely contaminated or destroyed, and the once clear boundary between evidence and interference had blurred. This situation frustrated the investigative team, as every new clue seemed to open more questions than it answered. This discovery left investigators puzzled. If the killer's motive was purely financial, why leave behind such a significant sum of money hidden in the suitcase? Clearly, the perpetrator either didn't know about its existence, which would contradict the theory that the killer was someone close to Shang Ming, or they had a different motive altogether. The presence of the suitcase money raised more questions than answers, and the mystery surrounding the missing keys became even more crucial. Investigators now began to suspect that the keys weren't taken for their monetary value, but rather for what they symbolized: control and access. Whoever took them might have wanted to ensure no one could enter the store easily after the crime, or perhaps they intended to return later without drawing attention. The idea that the murderer might have planned to revisit the scene chilled the entire investigation team. Continuing their deep probe, police expanded the search to pawn shops and small trading markets in neighboring towns, hoping the keys or any stolen items had been exchanged for money. Days of investigation yielded nothing, until one officer found a faint lead. At a local pawn shop, the owner recalled that a few days after the murder, a young man in his 20s had tried to sell an old keychain with several keys attached. The owner couldn't remember the man's face clearly, but he mentioned one distinct detail. The man wore a blue jacket with the logo of a nearby logistics company. Following this hint, investigators tracked down all employees of that company, cross-checking their backgrounds, work shifts, and connections to the Shang family. Among them, one name immediately drew attention: Li Hao, a part-time delivery worker who had previously made regular deliveries to Shang Yun's convenience store. Neighbors confirmed that Li Hao was often seen chatting with both brothers and had occasionally stayed behind after deliveries to drink tea or smoke with Shang Ming. This seemingly ordinary connection took on a darker meaning when police dug deeper into Li Hao's past. He had once been arrested for petty theft in another county, but released after paying compensation. Furthermore, he had a known gambling addiction and several outstanding debts. His profile matched the potential motive: financial desperation. Police quickly brought Li Hao in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, claiming he hadn't visited Shang Ming's store for weeks before the murder. However, when confronted with the pawnshop owner's statement, and shown the image from a nearby CCTV camera that captured a man in a blue logistics jacket walking near the store around 2 a.m. on the night of the murder, his calm demeanor began to crumble after hours of intense interrogation. Li Hao finally broke down. His confession, however, shocked even the most experienced investigators. According to Li Hao, the murder wasn't premeditated. At least, not initially. He admitted that he had gone to Sheng Ming's store late that night, hoping to borrow some money. He knew Sheng Ming as a kind man who often helped locals in need. But when Sheng Ming refused, explaining that most of his money was tied up in business expenses, Li Hao lost control. Overcome by desperation and anger, he struck Sheng Ming with a metal bar that he had been carrying for protection. Realizing what he had done, Li Hao panicked. In an attempt to make the scene look like a robbery, he pried open the drawers and took the small bills inside. The mineral water bottles, he explained, were placed on the body in a moment of confusion and guilt, an attempt to calm the spirit. According to a local superstition he believed in, where water symbolizes purity and peace for the deceased. When asked about the missing keys, Li Hao admitted to taking them because he feared someone might catch him returning to the scene. He had planned to come back later to steal more money, but never found the courage to do so. He eventually threw the keys into a nearby river. Following Li Hao's confession, police recovered the murder weapon hidden behind a barn near his rented house. Forensic tests confirmed that blood traces on the weapon matched Sheng Ming's DNA. The cigarette butt found at the scene also matched Li Hao's saliva sample, finally tying him conclusively to the crime. The case that had haunted Duchi County for months had finally reached its grim resolution. Li Hao was charged with intentional homicide and robbery. During his trial, he repeatedly apologized to Sheng Yun and the victims' relatives, but his remorse could not undo the tragedy. The court sentenced him to death with a 2-year reprieve, which in Chinese law often means life imprisonment if the prisoner shows good behavior. For Sheng Yun, the truth brought little comfort, though the murderer was punished. The guilt of having suspected his own brother, and the painful loss of the man who had once been his closest family, continued to torment him. As for the villagers, they would long remember the story of Sheng Ming, the gentle man whose death uncovered the darkness hidden behind ordinary lives in their quiet village. When police first learned that the prime suspect in a gruesome murder could be a 15-year-old boy, they were stunned. It seemed almost unthinkable that someone so young could commit such a violent and deliberate act. Yet, the chain of evidence, the newly printed 10-yuan bills, the timing, and the location all pointed toward one person, Jiang Tao. Investigators immediately launched a discreet background check on the boy. They discovered that Jiang Tao lived with his parents in a modest house on the outskirts of the village. His father worked as a truck driver and was often away, while his mother managed a small roadside food stall. Neighbors described Jiang Tao as quiet and introverted, but they also noted something unsettling, a noticeable change in his behavior over the past few months. Once obedient and shy, he had become more secretive, short-tempered, and obsessed with money and electronic gadgets. The police decided to approach the situation carefully. Considering his age, they needed to ensure that the investigation followed all juvenile protection procedures. On the morning of June 1st, officers visited Jiang Tao's home. The boy appeared calm when they arrived, even curious, but his demeanor shifted rapidly when they mentioned the murder of Sheng Ming. His hands began to tremble, and his answers grew evasive. When asked about the purchase of the mobile phone, Jiang Tao initially claimed that he had saved the money from doing part-time jobs at a construction site. However, when officers requested proof of employment or witnesses who could confirm this, he failed to provide any. The tension in the room grew heavier. His mother, visibly frightened, urged him to tell the truth, insisting that they had no idea where he had gotten such a large amount of new cash. With mounting pressure, Jiang Tao finally broke down. Tears filled his eyes as he confessed, in a trembling voice, that he had taken the money from Sheng Ming's store, but insisted that he didn't mean to kill anyone. He claimed that he had gone there that night, intending only to steal some cash. According to his statement, he had overheard his uncle discussing with Sheng Yun about a large amount of money kept in the store's drawer. Out of greed and youthful impulsiveness, Jiang Dao decided to sneak in while Sheng Ming was asleep. He explained that he used a spare key he had secretly copied weeks earlier when he helped Sheng Yun fix the store's front lock. Once inside, he quietly pried open one of the drawers and began taking the small bills. But as fate would have it, Sheng Ming woke up. Startled and panicked, Jiang Tao grabbed a nearby metal wrench from the workbench and struck him on the head. The blow was fatal. In tears, Jiang Tao told investigators that he had no idea what to do afterward. In a state of fear and confusion, he remembered a superstition his grandmother once mentioned, that placing bottles of clean water on a dead body could wash away bad luck. Believing it would somehow help him avoid punishment, he placed 5 mineral water bottles on Xiang Ming's chest before fleeing into the night with the stolen cash. When the confession ended, the interrogation room fell silent. Even the most hardened investigators couldn't hide their astonishment. The brutality of the crime was difficult to reconcile with the image of a frightened teenage boy sitting before them, trembling and crying uncontrollably. Police quickly verified his statement. Forensic experts confirmed that the fingerprints found on the mineral water bottles matched Jiang Dao's. Moreover, the serial numbers of the new 10 yuan bills used to buy the phone corresponded to those that had been withdrawn by Xiang Yun only days before the murder. Undeniable evidence linking Jiang Dao to the scene. Given his age, Jiang Dao was not eligible for the death penalty under Chinese law. The court later sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the possibility of sentence reduction for good behavior after several years. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community. Villagers who once saw Jiang Dao as a harmless teenager were devastated by the revelation. For Sheng Yun and his family, the truth was equally painful. While justice had been served, it came with the heavy realization that the killer was a boy from their own extended family, someone they had known and trusted. The tragedy of Sheng Ming's death became a haunting reminder to the people of Duchi County that beneath the surface of even the most peaceful villages, darkness can take root in the most unexpected hearts. His way to school every day. For a brief moment, there was a stunned silence, both frozen in disbelief. But that moment quickly turned into chaos. Fearing that the old man would report him to the police and that his family would find out, Jiang Tao panicked. In his confession, he said his mind went blank. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy wrench lying on the counter, and swung it with all his strength. The first blow struck Sheng Ming in the temple, and the man fell backward, moaning in pain. But instead of stopping, Jiang Dao struck again and again until the store fell silent. Blood splattered across the cash register and nearby shelves, dripping down onto the cold concrete floor. The sound of the ceiling fan and the faint buzz of a neon light were the only things breaking the heavy stillness that followed. When he realized the man was no longer breathing, fear set in. His hands trembled as he looked at the bloodstains covering his clothes. Still in shock, he began to wipe the counter and floor with tissues, trying to erase traces of his presence. Then, in a desperate attempt to make the scene look like a robbery, he took 8,000 yuan from the cash drawer, the same money investigators later found in his suitcase, and fled into the night. Instead of returning home, Jiang Dao went straight to an internet cafe. According to staff testimony, he arrived there at around 1:30 a.m., sweaty and agitated. He stayed for nearly 8 hours, playing online games continuously. When asked why he didn't feel guilt or fear during those hours, he said chillingly, "I wasn't thinking about what I did. I just wanted to play one more round." The police later found that the 8,000 yuan had been gradually spent across multiple gaming sessions over the next 2 days. He had even bought snacks for other players in the cafe, appearing cheerful and carefree. No one could have guessed that he had just taken a man's life. When officers arrested him, they found him seated calmly at a computer, playing the same online game that had consumed his life for years. He didn't try to escape or resist. Instead, he simply turned and asked, "Can I save my game first?" That single sentence would later become a haunting symbol of his complete detachment from reality, a 15-year-old, so deeply trapped in the virtual world that even the line between murder and a pause menu had disappeared at the police station. Forensic psychologists were called to evaluate him. Their reports described a disturbing profile, emotionally detached, with shallow affect and an underdeveloped sense of empathy. His moral compass, they noted, had been replaced by a reward-driven system rooted in online gratification. But the tragedy didn't end with his confession. When his grandmother was informed of his arrest and the nature of his crime, she collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Neighbors rushed to her side, but she couldn't stop repeating, "He's just a child. My little Tao couldn't have done this, ... She had believed, until the very end, that her grandson, the boy she had raised with trembling hands and tired eyes, was incapable of such a monstrous act. The story of Zheng Dao's descent into violence shocked the entire community. It wasn't just the brutality of the murder that horrified people, it was the fact that a seemingly ordinary, quiet boy could transform into a killer over something as trivial as a gaming debt. Psychologists and educators across China began discussing the deeper implications of the case, how unchecked addiction, family neglect, and emotional isolation could combine to create a perfect storm. As one psychologist said in a televised interview, this wasn't just a crime of greed, it was a symptom of abandonment. The system failed him long before he failed society. Being restrained by the station staff and passengers who had rushed in after hearing the woman's desperate screams. The attacker was immediately identified as a 31-year-old man named Chen, a former Seoul Metro employee. What made the case even more chilling was that Chen had previously worked in the same department as the victim, who was a 28-year-old named Kim, known among colleagues for her dedication and kindness. During the early stages of the investigation, police quickly determined that this was not a random act of violence, but a premeditated revenge attack. Chen had been dismissed from his position in 2021 due to repeated misconduct and workplace harassment complaints, one of which had been filed by Kim herself. According to the internal records of Seoul Metro, Chen had shown a pattern of stalking and intimidation toward female co-workers even after his dismissal. Several reports indicated that he continued sending threatening messages to Kim for nearly a year. But despite these warnings, no restraining order or enhanced security measures had been granted. The timeline before the tragedy revealed disturbing preparation. On September 14th, the day of the attack, Chen had been loitering around Sinlum and Sindang stations for over 2 hours before Kim's scheduled patrol shift began. CCTV footage later confirmed that he entered the restroom area just minutes before. Kim arrived, hiding quietly inside one of the stalls. At around 9 p.m., Kim entered the restroom as part of her routine inspection. As soon as she walked past Chen's hiding spot, he lunged out, wielding the knife. Witnesses outside recalled hearing a piercing scream, followed by muffled sounds of a struggle. The entire assault lasted less than 2 minutes, but the brutality of it left behind a scene of utter horror. When questioned, Chen initially refused to speak, maintaining a cold, detached expression. However, after several hours of interrogation, he admitted that he had planned to kill her for months. He claimed Kim had ruined his life by reporting him to management, which ultimately led to his dismissal. In a chilling statement recorded by investigators, Chen said, "I waited for this day. I wanted her to feel what I felt, powerless." The confession shocked the public and reignited debates about the protection of women in public spaces. The fact that Chen had managed to freely stalk Kim for months, despite multiple complaints and warnings, was seen as a massive systemic failure. As the details spread, the incident triggered nationwide outrage. Candlelight vigils were held across Seoul, and social media exploded with messages under the hashtag "Her name was Kim," calling for stricter anti-stalking laws and better workplace protection for many. Kim's story symbolized the deep-rooted issues in society, the lack of support for harassment victims, the failures of law enforcement to take threats seriously, and the vulnerability faced by women, even in supposedly safe zones. Kim's funeral was attended by hundreds of fellow Metro employees, activists, and citizens. Her parents, too heartbroken to speak publicly, only left a brief message through a representative. Our daughter was doing her duty, protecting others, but no one protected her. The Seoul Metropolitan Police later admitted that they had received 2 separate complaints from Kim months before the incident, but had not considered the threat level to be high. This revelation led to intense criticism and calls for reform. Within weeks, the National Assembly of South Korea proposed an amendment to the anti-stalking law, known as Kim's Law, to impose heavier penalties on repeat offenders and require authorities to act on credible threats immediately. During Chen's trial, in early 2023, the prosecution demanded a life sentence, citing the premeditation and the extreme cruelty of his actions. Throughout the proceedings, Chen remained disturbingly calm, even expressionless, often staring blankly ahead as testimonies were read. When given a chance to speak before sentencing, he offered no apology, only saying, "I don't regret what I did. She deserved it." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Some of Kim's co-workers broke down in tears, while others shouted angrily before being escorted out by security. Ultimately, the Seoul Central District Court sentenced Chen to 40 years in prison, declaring that his crime was driven by hatred and vengeance, representing one of the darkest forms of gender-based violence. Even after the sentencing, the trauma left behind by the case lingered. Seoul Metro installed emergency alarm buttons and surveillance in every women's restroom across major stations. Posters reading "You are not alone. Help is one button away" were placed across platforms, serving as both a warning and a promise. But for many Seoul residents, especially women, the haunting memory of that night at Sindang Station remains a constant reminder that even in the heart of a modern city, the promise of safety can vanish in a moment of human cruelty. Her final moments spoke volumes about her courage and will to live, even in the face of unimaginable fear and pain. Police investigators later concluded that this single act of bravery, pressing the alarm despite her injuries, was the decisive reason the suspect was caught before he could flee. However, the more details the investigative team uncovered, the more society began to question how such a tragedy could have been allowed to happen. It was revealed that A had filed multiple formal complaints to both Seoul Metro and local police over a span of nearly 2 years. Each report described escalating harassment, from obsessive messages to stalking near her workplace, and even threats of violence. Despite this, the system had failed to protect her. In one of her final reports to the police, filed just 2 weeks before her death, she had written a desperate plea: "I'm scared to go to work. He's still following me. Please help me before something happens." That warning, haunting in hindsight, had gone unanswered. The local authorities had only issued a temporary restraining order, but they didn't assign police monitoring or install protective measures around her workplace. The legal process for the stalking case was slow, with court hearings delayed multiple times. Ironically, the final sentencing for Yuan's stalking charges was scheduled for September 15th, one day after he brutally murdered her. Investigators reconstructed the killer's timeline before the attack. On the evening of September 14th, 2022, Ruhan arrived at Sindang Station around 7:30 p.m., 2 hours before A's shift. CCTV footage captured him wandering the platforms, checking the restroom area repeatedly. He wore a black hoodie, blue gloves, and carried a small bag, inside of which was the folding knife later found at the scene. He entered the women's restroom shortly before 9 p.m., hiding inside one of the stalls. At 9:03 p.m., A entered the restroom as part of her scheduled patrol inspection, completely unaware of what awaited her inside. Moments later, the attack began. According to forensic analysis, the entire assault lasted less than 90 seconds. But in that short time, I suffered 12 stab wounds, most of them fatal. The emergency alarm she managed to press triggered the station-wide alert that brought help, but it was too late. Witnesses described the scene as a nightmare that will never be forgotten. One female colleague, trembling as she recalled the event, said, "I ran toward the alarm sound. When we opened the door, she was lying there. I still remember the blood on her hands. She had pressed the alarm trying to survive." When questioned by police, Ruwan at first pretended confusion, repeatedly muttering, "I regret what I did," but his remorse quickly evaporated. During formal interrogation, he confessed that he had planned the attack for weeks, buying the knife and gloves online, memorizing A's patrol schedule, and waiting for the perfect time when she would be alone. His exact words were chilling. "If she hadn't reported me, none of this would have happened. I wanted her to know what it feels like to lose everything." The confession caused public outrage across South Korea. Citizens and media condemned the systemic negligence that had failed to protect a young woman whose pleas for help were repeatedly ignored. Demonstrations broke out outside Seoul City Hall, where thousands gathered, holding candles and signs reading, "She asked for help." No one listened. And this is not just a murder, it's a failure of justice. The tragedy at Sindang Station became a turning point for the nation. Activists, lawmakers, and women's rights organizations demanded urgent reforms to South Korea's anti-stalking laws, which had long been criticized as too lenient. Before this incident, stalking was often treated as a misdemeanor, punishable only by fines unless physical harm occurred, a loophole that had allowed countless cases to escalate unchecked. In the weeks following A's death, the South Korean government announced new emergency measures. The Ministry of Justice proposed amendments allowing police to detain stalkers preemptively if victims report credible threats. Additionally, Seoul Metro installed panic buttons, CCTV systems, and 24-hour patrols in all women's restrooms across major subway stations. Public mourning for continued 4 months. A memorial was set up at Sindang Station, where hundreds of commuters left flowers, letters, and handwritten notes. One note read, "You pressed the alarm, not just for yourself, but for every woman who has ever been afraid." A's mother, heartbroken and grieving, spoke publicly for the first time during a candlelight vigil. "My daughter did everything right. She asked for help. She followed the law. She trusted the system, but the system did nothing. Now she's gone, and I can't forgive that." When the case finally went to trial, prosecutors sought life imprisonment for Ruwan, arguing that his crime was not just murder, but a deliberate act of terror against a woman who had stood up for herself. During court hearings, his behavior was described as disturbingly detached, showing no emotion, no remorse. When asked if he regretted killing her, he replied coldly, "She made her choice. I made mine." The court's verdict was delivered in May 2023. The judge called it a crime of pure malice and vengeance, sentencing Ruwan to 40 years in prison, one of the harshest penalties ever given for gender-based violence in South Korea. But even as justice was served, the pain remained. Sindang Station, once an ordinary metro stop, became a symbol of national shame and reflection. The sign reading "Safe Women's Restroom," still hanging near the entrance, stood as a haunting reminder of a life lost and a system that failed. In the end, A's story sparked real change. Her courage and tragic death pushed South Korea to finally recognize stalking as a serious, violent crime, not a minor nuisance. Her name, though never officially released in public, became a symbol whispered through every protest and reform, a reminder that silence and neglect can be just as deadly as the knife itself, obstructing the investigation. As a result, despite clear evidence of harassment and stalking, Ruwan was released and allowed to move freely, continuing his life as though nothing had happened. That single decision, seemingly procedural, would later be seen as one of the most fatal errors in the entire chain of events. After his release, Juan wasted no time reinitiating contact with the victim. He began sending her messages that alternated between apology and intimidation, a cruel emotional pendulum that left her in a constant state of fear and anxiety. Friends recalled that she often avoided walking home alone, checking behind her frequently, and even refused to use public transportation after dark. In early 2022, the victim's mother told investigators that her daughter had seriously considered quitting her job, terrified that the man who had once been her colleague might appear again. But A was also she didn't want to let fear dictate her life. She often reassured her mother with trembling confidence, saying, "If I keep running, he wins. I just want to live normally." That resolve, noble as it was, ultimately became the reason she continued to show up to work at Sindang Station, unaware that the system meant to protect her had already failed her multiple times by mid-2022. As the legal proceedings moved forward, investigators noted that no active restraining order or 24-hour protective detail had been assigned to her. Despite the clear threat history, the police only contacted her occasionally for procedural updates, never offering consistent safety monitoring. This lack of protection gave Ruwan both time and confidence to plan his revenge in chilling detail. On August 18, 2022, when the prosecution recommended a 9-year prison sentence, witnesses in court described seeing Ruwan's expression twist from shock to visible rage. He clenched his fists, trembling, and muttered something under his breath, something the court stenographer didn't record but which one observer remembered as, "She'll pay for this." That was the day, investigators later concluded, when the idea of murder fully took root in his mind. Over the next 4 weeks, he prepared. He practiced using the knife, downloaded location spoofing apps, and visited her former neighborhood repeatedly to rehearse the attack. The level of premeditation was staggering, even chillingly methodical. He had become obsessed with controlling the narrative of his own downfall, believing that by killing her, he could reclaim the dignity she had stolen. When the court documents detailing his plan were later made public, the public was horrified to read the handwritten notes found in his backpack. In one of them, he had scribbled, "If the world won't listen to me, I'll make it listen with her blood." This note, combined with the dozens of deleted messages recovered from his phone, painted the portrait of a man consumed by delusion, convinced that he was the victim of injustice rather than the perpetrator of evil. After the crime, as the public learned more about the repeated failures of the authorities, the ignored reports, the rejected detention request, and the absence of immediate protective measures, mass outrage erupted across South Korea. Citizens flooded social media and online forums demanding accountability, using hashtags like #JusticeForSindang, victim, and #ProtectTheNextA. Protesters gathered outside Seoul's City Hall, holding candles, chanting for stronger anti-stalking laws and better enforcement of protective measures for women reporting harassment. For many, this tragedy wasn't just a single case. It was a mirror reflecting the deep flaws of a system that only acted after the damage was done. Within weeks, under immense public pressure, South Korea's Ministry of Justice announced a comprehensive review of the nation's anti-stalking and harassment laws, aiming to make restraining orders easier to obtain and to ensure immediate detention for repeat offenders deemed dangerous. But for the victim's family, it was too late. Her mother broke down during an interview, crying out words that haunted the nation. "The law came too late for my daughter, but please, make it come in time for someone else's." The case of the Sindang Station murder became one of the most pivotal in modern South Korean criminal justice history, not only for its cruelty, but for the questions it forced society to confront. Why do systems built to protect still allow monsters to slip through? How many warnings does it take before action is taken? In the end, when the Seoul Central District Court sentenced Ruwan to life imprisonment, the judge's closing statement summed up the horror of the crime. This was not a crime of passion. It was a deliberate act of vengeance, born from obsession. You robbed a young woman of her life because she dared to stand up for herself. As the sentence was read, Ruwan showed no visible emotion, just the same cold, hollow stare he had carried since the night of the murder. For the people of Seoul, that lifeless stare symbolized something larger, the failure of a system that waited too long to open its eyes. Prosecution formally charged Ruwan with multiple counts, including premeditated murder, illegal stalking, unauthorized access to information systems, and violations of privacy and public safety laws. The detailed case, files spanning over 1,000 pages outlined, a chilling picture of not just a single act of violence, but a long-term failure of preventive justice that allowed a dangerous man to operate unchecked until tragedy struck. The court proceedings began in December 2022, drawing immense public and media attention. Every hearing was broadcast and discussed across South Korea. Citizens demanded to know how a man who had been reported multiple times, whose threats were documented, and whose harassment had been proven, was still able to walk free until he murdered an innocent woman. During the first hearing, Ruwan appeared calm, emotionless, and eerily composed. Dressed in a plain gray detention uniform, he avoided eye contact with everyone in the courtroom, especially the victim's grieving family. When questioned by the presiding judge about his motive, he answered coldly, "I lost everything because of her. She ruined my life, my job, my reputation. I just wanted her to feel what I felt." His words sent a collective shiver through the courtroom. Reporters later described the atmosphere as heavy and suffocating, with the victim's mother breaking down in uncontrollable sobs. The prosecutors, presenting the full body of evidence, reconstructed Ruwan's calculated plan: the GPS spoofing, the stalking, the hacking into Seoul Metro's internal system, and his purchase of the weapon days before the attack. They showed surveillance footage capturing his movements, step-by-step stalking her old home, entering Sindang Station, waiting by the women's restroom, and finally fleeing after committing the crime to everyone's astonishment. Ruwan's defense lawyers attempted to argue that he was suffering from diminished mental capacity due to obsessive-compulsive disorder and depression, hoping to reduce his sentence. However, psychiatric experts who examined him rejected this claim outright, concluding that, although he displayed obsessive and delusional tendencies, he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Dr. Kim Yoon-hae, a leading forensic psychologist, testified, "This was not an impulsive or uncontrollable act. It was a deliberate, goal-oriented attack. He understood the illegality, yet continued because he wanted control and revenge." This expert testimony shattered any remaining sympathy for the perpetrator. The court also reviewed internal communications between Seoul Metro officials and law enforcement, revealing another disturbing truth. Months before the murder, the company had received several warnings about potential security risks regarding their employee database. Yet, no action was taken to strengthen the system's protections, allowing Ruwan to repeatedly access the internal network using his old credentials. This revelation sparked public outrage. 4 days, headlines across major news outlets read, "Systemic negligence killed her, and how many warnings does it take?" As the trial progressed, countless citizens attended court sessions, filling the public gallery to capacity. Outside, activists held vigils, lighting candles and holding signs that read "Justice for Sindang Victim" and "Stop Protecting Stalkers." The victim's family attended every hearing. Her mother, visibly aged and frail, often clutched her daughter's photograph tightly against her chest. In one session, she stood up through tears and said to Ruwan directly, "You said she ruined your life, but she gave you chances to stop. She asked for help from the law that failed her. You didn't just take her life, you destroyed ours too." Her emotional outburst moved even some police officers to tears. After nearly 5 months of proceedings, on May 24, 2023, the Seoul Central District Court delivered its final verdict. The presiding judge, Kim Jae-hoon, read the sentence slowly and firmly. The defendant, Ruwan, committed an act of premeditated, cruel, and unforgivable violence. His actions stemmed from a deep, selfish hatred and disregard for human dignity. The court sees no possibility of rehabilitation. Therefore, the court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some cried in relief. Others sat in silence, processing the finality of the words. Ruwan remained motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, showing neither remorse nor emotion. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered as the verdict was announced live on television. Cheers of relief, mixed with tears, filled the crowd, though many still felt that true justice had come too late. Following the verdict, South Korea's Ministry of Justice faced immense pressure to reform its anti-stalking and victim protection laws. Within months, the Sindang Station Law was drafted, a legislative reform proposal aimed at closing legal loopholes in handling stalking and harassment cases. The proposed measures included mandatory detention for repeat stalking offenders under investigation. Real-time digital monitoring for individuals issued restraining orders, automatic renewal of victim protection services unless the victim explicitly opts out after evaluation, stricter data access controls for public sector systems, handling employee information. By late 2023, portions of these reforms were officially adopted, marking a turning point in South Korean law enforcement's approach to gender-based violence. Yet, for those who knew victim A personally, no law could fill the void she left. Her colleagues at Seoul Metro later built a small memorial at Sindang Station, near the spot where she was attacked. Flowers, handwritten notes, and folded paper cranes filled the space. Every year on September 14th, subway staff and passengers pause for a minute of silence as trains momentarily slowed down while passing through the station. Her mother continues to visit the memorial regularly. In one interview, she said quietly, "My daughter was brave. She spoke up when it was easier to stay silent. I just hope her courage saves someone else's child." The Sindang Station murder became one of South Korea's most influential and haunting cases, a symbol of systemic failure, societal awakening, and a mother's grief that transformed into reform. Her hometown. She was renting a small but cozy apartment near Mercer Law School, a place that gave her peace and quiet to study for the bar exam. Her neighbors described her as kind, polite, and always smiling when passing by. Everything about Lauren's life seemed bright and full of promise. However, that peaceful world would soon come crashing down in one of the most shocking and disturbing crimes in Georgia's history. Lauren's apartment was part of a small, 2-story complex mostly rented by law students. Among those tenants was a man named Stephen McDaniel, 25 years old, who lived right next door. He had recently graduated from the same law school as Lauren. Stephen was known around the complex as awkward and quiet, polite, but strange. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his conversations often felt uncomfortable. Many classmates described him as socially invisible. He didn't have many friends, didn't drink, and spent most of his time alone, either reading or lurking online. But behind that quiet, unassuming appearance was something much darker. Lauren, always kind-hearted, tried to be friendly with him. They had studied together before and occasionally chatted about exams or schoolwork. However, over time, her friends noticed something unsettling. Stephen seemed obsessed with her. He would watch her every move, often pretending to run into her, coincidentally. On multiple occasions, Neighbors had seen him standing outside her window late at night, claiming he was just getting air. Lauren, being the kind person she was, never wanted to assume the worst, but deep down, she started to feel uneasy then. One morning in late June 2011, something felt off. Lauren's friends hadn't heard from her for several days. That wasn't like her. She was always active on social media, especially texting with friends and family. Her sister Caitlin tried calling, but every call went unanswered. Then David, her boyfriend, grew worried too. He hadn't heard from her since June 25th, and her silence terrified him. He reached out to some of her friends in Macon, asking them to check on her. When they arrived at her apartment complex on June 29th, they knocked repeatedly. No answer. Her car was still parked outside, and Butterbean's faint barking could be heard inside. Something was definitely wrong. They called the police. When officers arrived and entered Lauren's apartment, the scene was eerily clean. Her purse, keys, and cell phone were all inside. Nothing appeared stolen or broken. Yet Lauren herself was nowhere to be found. Officers expanded their search to the nearby area, checking the parking lot and trash bins outside. That's when one officer noticed a strong foul odor coming from one of the dumpsters near the complex. When they lifted the lid and looked inside, they made a horrifying discovery: a human torso wrapped in black plastic bags. Within hours, investigators confirmed the unthinkable. It was Lauren Giddings. The rest of her body was missing. The discovery stunned the entire community. A quiet, respected law graduate, brutally murdered just days after finishing school. News of the case spread like wildfire. Reporters swarmed the scene. Among the bystanders was none other than Stephen McDaniel, Lauren's next-door neighbor. And strangely, he gave an interview to a local TV station right there, in front of the apartment building. In the now infamous clip, Stephen looked pale and nervous. He told the reporter how sweet and kind Lauren was and how everyone was worried sick. But then, mid-interview, the reporter suddenly mentioned that police had found a body in the dumpster. Stephen froze. His face turned blank, his mouth dropped open, and he whispered, "A body." For several seconds, he stood completely still, his expression shifting from shock to panic. Then he abruptly ended the interview and walked away. That reaction instantly raised suspicion. The next day, police brought Stephen in for questioning. At first, he played the part of the concerned neighbor, insisting he knew nothing and had only recently noticed Lauren missing. But as the interrogation went on, his story began to crumble. Detectives noticed he was trembling, avoiding eye contact, and sweating profusely. When they searched his apartment, they found chilling evidence. Inside his bedroom were several items linking him directly to the crime: a master key to the apartment complex, a pair of gloves, packaging for a hacksaw, and a flash drive filled with disturbing content. But perhaps most horrifying of all, they found a video camera hidden inside a bookshelf. On it were secretly recorded videos of Lauren in her apartment, footage taken through her window while she was changing clothes. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic testing revealed Lauren's blood on a pair of shorts found in Stephen's laundry. The hacksaw packaging matched a blade discovered in the dumpster with her remains. And that master key, it allowed access to every apartment in the building, including Lauren's. Stephen McDaniel was arrested and charged with the murder and dismemberment of Lauren Giddings. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a horrific picture emerged. On the night of June 25th, Stephen had used the master key to quietly enter Lauren's apartment while she was asleep. He strangled her to death, then returned the next day to dismember her body in the bathtub. He spent the next 2 days disposing of her remains, piece by piece, into the apartment complex's dumpster. The motive, prosecutors later revealed, stemmed from obsession and rejection. Stephen had secretly fixated on Lauren for months, watching her every move, recording her without her knowledge, and fantasizing about her. When he realized she was moving forward with her life, possibly reuniting with her boyfriend, his obsession turned into rage. The trial that followed captivated the nation. In 2014, Stephen McDaniel pleaded guilty to malice murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. When given a chance to speak, he muttered only a few words, apologizing to Lauren's family. But her parents refused to look at him. To them, no apology could ever bring back their daughter. Lauren's death devastated everyone who knew her. Her classmates, professors, and friends gathered for vigils, remembering her as the bright, compassionate woman who wanted to help others through law. Mercer University later established a scholarship in her honor, the Lauren Teresa Giddings Scholarship, to support students who aspire to become public defenders, just as she had dreamed. And as for Stephen McDaniel, he remains behind bars, spending the rest of his life in silence. The same silence he once used to hide his obsession. The same silence that, for Lauren, became fatal. Trusted, or at least thought they could trust. But now, as police started talking to everyone again, Stephen's behavior began to stand out more and more. When officers came to his door and asked to take a look around, he hesitated, clutching the frame, saying quietly, "Do you have a warrant?" He was polite, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, unnatural. While others seemed desperate to help, Stephen was almost robotic. Still, police didn't push too hard that first day. They had no direct evidence yet, but as the investigation progressed, they began paying closer attention to him. When investigators returned later for follow-up interviews, Stephen volunteered to talk to reporters outside the building, an odd move for someone supposedly so private. He gave a calm, almost emotionless interview, describing Lauren as a good person, saying she was probably just out somewhere. But when the reporter mentioned that police had found a body in the trash bin, everything changed. The color drained from his face. His breathing quickened. His lips trembled as he repeated the reporter's words, almost whispering, "A body." Then, without another word, he froze, eyes wide, and abruptly walked away. That moment was caught live on camera and would later go viral. The precise second investigators believe he realized the walls were closing in. From that point on, Stephen McDaniel was under constant surveillance. Detectives noticed him pacing outside late at night, throwing away small items, and behaving nervously whenever police cars drove by. When a warrant was finally issued to search his apartment, what they found made even the most seasoned investigators shudder. Inside the small, cluttered one-bedroom unit were several disturbing items: a master key to the entire Barristers Hall complex, a pair of surgical gloves, a package for a hacksaw, and a mask. On his computer, they discovered hours of voyeuristic material, and even homemade recordings, hidden behind a vent. Officers found a small camera containing secretly recorded footage of Lauren inside her apartment. The videos had been taken through her window at night, often while she was changing clothes or studying. It was clear he had been stalking her for months. DNA analysis soon confirmed that blood found on a pair of shorts in his laundry matched Lauren's, and the hacksaw packaging matched the exact model used to dismember her. When confronted with this evidence, Stephen initially denied everything, but after hours of questioning, his composure cracked. He slumped forward, buried his face in his hands, and muttered, "I hurt her." The confession that followed was chilling. Stephen admitted to using the master key to enter Lauren's apartment late at night on June 25th. He stood over her as she slept and attacked her, strangling her until she stopped moving. He then returned the next morning to clean the scene and dismember her body in the bathtub. He claimed he panicked afterward and dumped parts of her body in the dumpster behind the complex. When the full story came out, friends, family, and even former classmates were horrified. No one could comprehend how a quiet, awkward law student, someone who seemed harmless, could be capable of something so monstrous. In 2014, facing overwhelming evidence, Stephen McDaniel pleaded guilty to malice murder to avoid the death penalty. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, Lauren's father, Bill Giddings, stood up and looked straight at Stephen. His voice shook as he said, "You took a wonderful, loving person from this world. I hope you spend every day of your life remembering what you did to her." Stephen said nothing. He just stood there, staring at the floor, the same floor where he had once watched his victim walk past him, smiling, unaware of the danger that lived next door. Lauren's legacy, however, lived on. Her friends and family created the Lauren Teresa Giddings Scholarship at Mercer University, awarded to law students passionate about public defense, the path Lauren had dreamed of following. And to this day, the story of Barrister's Hall stands as a haunting reminder that sometimes evil doesn't hide in the dark. It lives quietly, behind the door right next to yours. Stephen didn't respond. He just sat there, completely motionless, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on the table. The detective leaned in closer, lowering his voice, trying to appeal to something human inside him. "Stephen," he said softly, "look at me. You've got to help us understand what happened. Lauren didn't deserve what happened to her. You know that, right?" There was a long, heavy silence. The air in the interrogation room felt thick. Then, almost imperceptibly, Stephen's lips began to move. I don't remember," he mumbled. Detective Patterson's patience was wearing thin. "You don't remember? Stephen, people don't forget doing something like this. You lived right next door to her. You were the last one to see her, and you knew things only the killer could know." The detective's words seemed to hang in the air. Stephen blinked once, twice, then whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt her." It was the first real thing he had said all night. Patterson's tone shifted instantly from frustration to focus. "Okay, Stephen, tell me what happened. Start from the beginning." Stephen's hands trembled slightly on the table. He stared at them as though they didn't belong to him. She was leaving," he said quietly. "She was gonna move in with David. She wasn't supposed to leave." "What do you mean, wasn't supposed to leave?" Patterson asked, his voice calm but sharp. Stephen's breathing grew heavier. "I went into her apartment before," he said. "Not to hurt her, just to look, to see her things." "You broke in?" Stephen nodded faintly. "When she wasn't home, I just wanted to be close to her. But then she found out someone had been there." Detective Patterson leaned back, realization beginning to set in, and she got scared. Stephen's voice cracked as he continued. "That night, I saw her through the window. I thought I just wanted to talk, but she screamed." He covered his face with his hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't mean for her to stop breathing." For a long time, no one said anything. The sound of the air conditioner hummed faintly in the background. Patterson knew the confession wasn't complete, but it was enough to know that the monster they had been searching for had been sitting across from them all along. When he finally spoke again, his tone was cold and deliberate. "Stephen," he said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Lauren Giddings." Was stacking up against him the hacksaw, the master key, the blood evidence, and his disturbing online behavior. Stephen McDaniel continued to maintain his innocence. His demeanor in court was just as unsettling as it had been in the interrogation room. He often stared blankly ahead, barely blinking, speaking only when directly addressed. When he did speak, his voice was low, flat, and emotionless, as if he were describing someone else's crime, not his own. The courtroom was filled with tension. Lauren's family sat together in quiet grief, their faces pale but determined to see justice served. Her father, Bill, gripped his wife's hand tightly as the prosecution laid out the horrifying details of what Stephen had done to their daughter. Each photograph, each forensic detail, was like reopening a wound that had barely begun to scar. The prosecution explained how Lauren's final hours were pieced together through evidence. On the night of June 25th, she had emailed her boyfriend, David, saying she feared someone had tried to break into her apartment. She had been right. Investigators believed Stephen had been watching her for days, possibly weeks, planning exactly how to attack. They theorized he entered her apartment with the master key in the early hours, when she was asleep. There had been no signs of a struggle, no cries for help that neighbors heard. It was quick, calculated, and horrifyingly intimate. After killing her, Stephen dismembered her body in her bathtub using the hacksaw later found in the maintenance room. He disposed of parts of her remains in the garbage bins outside the complex, assuming no one would check before collection day. But his plan failed when a maintenance worker noticed a strange smell and called the police. When this was revealed in court, there were audible gasps. Lauren's mother broke down, unable to listen any further, while her sister turned her face away, tears silently falling. Even seasoned journalists covering the trial looked shaken. The defense tried to argue that there was no direct witness to the murder, that some evidence was circumstantial, and that Stephen's odd behavior didn't necessarily mean guilt, only mental instability. But the sheer weight of physical evidence, combined with his incriminating search history and his proximity to the crime, made it nearly impossible for the jury to see him as anything other than the perpetrator. After months of hearings and delays, Stephen finally accepted a plea deal in 2014, just days before the trial was set to begin. In exchange for pleading guilty to Lauren Giddings' murder, the death penalty was taken off the table. The courtroom was silent as the judge asked him to confirm his plea. He simply said, "Yes, sir," without raising his head. When asked if he wanted to make a statement, he remained silent. The prosecutor then read Lauren's family's victim impact statements aloud. Her sister, Caitlin, said, "You didn't just take my sister's life. You destroyed every dream she had. Every moment our family was supposed to share with her. You will never know love, never know peace, never know forgiveness." Stephen showed no visible reaction. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The guards led him away in chains, his head still bowed, the same emotionless figure that had haunted everyone since the day Lauren went missing. Years later, investigators would say, Stephen's crime was one of the most chilling they'd ever seen, not only because of its brutality, but because of the sheer lack of emotion behind it. He didn't kill out of rage or desperation. He killed because he wanted control, because in his twisted mind, owning Lauren's fate made him powerful. Lauren's friends and family have since dedicated their lives to keeping her memory alive. They created scholarships in her name for law students, ensuring her dream of helping others' lives on, even though her own life was stolen by someone she once tried to be kind to. And Stephen McDaniel, once a promising law student, now spends every day behind bars, surrounded by the same silence he once sat in during that eerie interrogation. But now, it's not the silence of control. It's the silence of a man who will die alone, haunted by what he did to the woman who only ever showed him kindness. Have been profoundly broken to do what I did. I am so sorry for what happened, and I know that I deserve to be punished for it." But his words rang hollow in the courtroom. Lauren's family sat in silence, staring ahead, their faces blank, their eyes red. Her mother, Karen, quietly shook her head as if to say there was no apology that could ever touch the pain he'd caused. The prosecutor looked up from the statement and said coldly, "What you did was not a mistake, Stephen. It was a choice, a deliberate, calculated act of evil." When the judge finally handed down his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, there was no celebration, no applause, just quiet, a kind of numb relief that the long nightmare had finally reached its legal end. Stephen McDaniel was escorted out of the courtroom in shackles. He didn't look back once. No emotion, no remorse, just the same blank, lifeless stare he'd shown since the day he was arrested. In the months that followed, Macon, Georgia, tried to move on, but the shadow of what had happened still lingered. The law school where both Stephen and Lauren studied held a memorial service each year in her honor. Professors and students shared stories of her laughter, her kindness, her determination. She had dreamed of becoming a public defender, someone who would fight for justice, and even in death. Her name became synonymous with it. Her friends remembered how she used to light up every room she entered, how she always made time to help others, even when she was exhausted from her own studies. And perhaps the cruelest part of it all was that it was her kindness, the way she tried to be polite, even to someone who made her uncomfortable, that had ultimately placed her in the path of her killer. Stephen's family never spoke publicly again. His parents attended the trial quietly, devastated and ashamed. They had raised a son who, by all accounts, was intelligent and full of potential, but beneath that quiet exterior had lurked something dark, something no one could have imagined. Inside prison, Stephen McDaniel remains isolated. Reports describe him as withdrawn and silent, barely interacting with other inmates. Some guards say he spends most of his time reading law books, the same books he once used to dream of defending justice, now serving as reminders of everything he destroyed. Lauren's family, meanwhile, found some measure of peace in knowing he would never walk free. In interviews, her mother said, "I don't think we'll ever understand why he did it. Evil doesn't always make sense, but we can make sure Lauren's name stands for something good." The Lauren Teresa Giddings Scholarship was established at Mercer Law School, awarded to students who demonstrate compassion, perseverance, and a commitment to justice. Her family visits every year to meet the recipients, to remind themselves that even in the face of such darkness, Lauren's light continues to guide others. And as for Stephen McDaniel, the boy who once dreamed of being a lawyer, the man who took the life of the woman who tried to be his friend, he now sits in a tiny cell, surrounded by the silence he once used to hide his guilt. There are no cameras now, no interviews, no sympathetic audience, just the crushing quiet of his own making. Lauren's story serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers that can hide behind a friendly face, and the fragility of trust in a world where evil sometimes wears the mask of the ordinarily one. Stephen McDaniel's apology and sentencing. After confessing, McDaniel told Lauren's family he was sorry and that he grieved her death every day. But he admitted he didn't expect forgiveness because what he did was unforgivable. The prosecutors didn't seek the death penalty, not because of sympathy for him, but because Lauren herself had been against capital punishment. Her family respected her beliefs and said they hoped McDaniel lived a long life in the worst possible way, meaning that prison would be his punishment. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole until 2041.2. McDaniel's complaints from prison. After being sentenced, McDaniel began to blame police and his lawyers, claiming his case was unfair. He wrote a 2-page handwritten letter saying that during the interrogation, police yelled at him, intimidated him, and denied him bathroom access. He claimed he had a seizure and wasn't given proper medical care until he let police search his apartment. He insisted that the police had coerced him and demanded a new trial, claiming his confession was forced. 3. McDaniel's appeals and legal battles. Years later, McDaniel filed an appeal representing himself, acting as his own lawyer. He called over 10 witnesses, including his former attorney Floyd Buford, who testified that McDaniel had confessed in detail in jail. Buford said the evidence was overwhelming. McDaniel had searched online for necrophilia, sex with dead bodies. He possessed horrific child pornography, some of the worst his lawyer had ever seen. McDaniel accused his legal team of ineffective representation and sued for $300,000 in damages. He also accused the judge of being biased, but his appeal was denied. 4. Continued. appeals and family denial. McDaniel didn't stop there. He filed another appeal in 2022, again claiming his rights were violated and the prosecution had stolen documents. His father supported him, saying they just wanted the truth to come out. However, the judge said the appeal was filed too late and dismissed it. His father even started a GoFundMe to raise legal funds, but it got no donations and was quickly removed. Lauren's sister, Caitlin, called it pathetic and delusional. McDaniel's grandfather and mother still believed he was innocent. His grandfather said visiting him in jail broke his heart, describing him as emotionless and quiet. His mother even claimed she envisioned him becoming a Supreme Court justice someday, completely detached from the reality of his crimes. 5. Police and family's final thoughts for law enforcement and Lauren's family. The case was closed. Police said they believed McDaniel was a serial killer in the making, and that catching him early prevented future victims. Investigators noted that if the trash bin containing Lauren's torso had been emptied that day, the case might have gone cold, and McDaniel could have gotten away. Detectives, said McDaniel, had never told the full truth about what really happened that night. Lauren's sister Sarah said they didn't believe a single thing McDaniel had said since the murder, describing him as someone with a twisted imagination who makes up stories. 6. Remembering Lauren even after all these years. Lauren's remains have not been fully found, though police still search areas connected to McDaniel's family. Legal experts believe that even though he's technically eligible for parole in 2041, he'll likely die in prison. Lauren's family continues to honor her. They celebrate milestones and birthdays as if she's still there. They organize runs in her memory each year. There are 2 memorial plaques for her, one at Mercer Law School and another on a pink bench in Washington Park, where she used to jog. The Lauren Teresa Giddings Scholarship was founded at the law firm where she trained. Lauren loved bright pink and was known for her cheerful personality. Friends compared her to Elle Woods from Legally Blonde. She was ambitious, hard-working, and never afraid to stand out. Her family says she still exists in their lives, just differently. The ending lines, as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.